Hello and welcome back to our little history of French Indochina. Thank you for being here, and if you like what you hear, please talk about the podcast around you. Word of mouth is the best you can do to help this podcast grow. And if you can as well, please on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave us a review or rating that will help the algorithm spread the podcast to the widest audience. So thank you in advance. So last week, we ended 1948 with a stalemate, both on the military front and on the diplomatic front. Military-wise, the Ho Chi Minh government, while it did not have the means to control the whole country, maintained the capacity to wage a deadly guerrilla war on the French troops. The second impasse was political. On the one hand, you had the DRV that was still not recognized by any country on earth, but on the other hand, France refused to ratify the Ha Long Bay agreements that created the Provisional Central Government of Viet Nam. And that French position was a massive embarrassment for the Vietnamese non-communist nationalists. Here they were collaborating with the colonial power, and what did they have to show for it? Nothing. France was taking them for a ride, promising independence without ever fulfilling the promise. And that was the reason why Bao Daï fled again to the French Riviera and refused to return to Vietnam until the French granted him real and meaningful independence. And while he was away, every day the Provisional Central Government of Vietnam, led by General Xuan, the government was losing the little credibility it had to start with. And that was excellent news for Ho Chi Minh and the DRV, because when the Vietnamese population saw what was before them, they voted with their feet by massively backing Ho Chi Minh. So the DRV's popular base expanded, and they were able to recruit more and more fighters. Last time as well, if you remember, we touched on briefly on the enormous threat that was looming in China for the French. A communist victory was anything but certain, and Ho Chi Minh and his government were anything but certain to get out of the diplomatic isolation they have been in so far. Therefore, the DRV could wait and see. But the ones who could not afford to stand still were the French, Bao Daï, and the Vietnamese nationalists. They had to make a move quickly to get out of the impasse before the Chinese communist takeover put Ho Chi Minh in the driver's seat. The first one to make a move was the former emperor Bao Daï. Bao Daï lacked many qualities as a leader, but he was smart. He could see that the writing was on the wall in China and that the communists would win. He understood that because of the Chinese threat, the French were now in a hurry to reach a political agreement, and for that to happen, France was ready to make more concessions than before. At the same time, Bao Daï knew that the French politicians were very frustrated with his stubbornness about total and meaningful independence. The French political class just could not understand why Bao Daï, this guy who they had fed, they have clothes, they had put in the best schools in Paris, why this guy couldn't just get back to Vietnam and help them rule. French politicians thought that the former emperor was stabbing them in the back, after everything we did for him. And they even resorted to mockery and started calling Bao Daï the casinos and nightclubs emperor. Basically, the French politicians were disillusioned with him, and that started to worry the former emperor. What if the French turned away from him and explored other possibilities? They could, for example, reactivate the Republic of Cochinchina. So Bao Daï could sense both an opportunity but also a threat as 1948 started. Yes, the French were now in a hurry to find a settlement, but at the same time, Bao Daï ran the risk of becoming irrelevant if the French chose to go without him. That's why the former emperor decided to take the plunge, crossing his fingers that the Americans would help him. His bet was that to contain communist China, the Truman administration would increase its support for France in Indochina, but would condition that aid by demanding that France grant real independence to Vietnam. The Americans would then support an anti-communist regime led by a nationalist and popular sovereign, Bao Daï himself. But Bao Daï lost his bet. Why? Well, because the French did not give in to American demands. And when I say the French, I mean High Commissioner Léon Pignon, who was very instrumental in bringing in the Americans without letting go of Indochina. To talk about Pignon and the solution he found for Bao Daï, I am relying heavily here on the work of Christopher Gauchat, one of the best scholars of Vietnam, whom I had the pleasure to interview when I was doing my research. Gauchat has written extensively on Vietnam and the Indochina War, and I could not recommend his work enough. According to Christopher Gauchat, Léon Pignon, a colonial civil servant since the 1930s, was the brains behind what he calls the post-war Bao Daï Solution. Why post-war? Well, because there was a pre-war Bao Daï Solution that we talked about in episodes 3 and 4. Well, Léon Pignon replaced Bollard as High Commissioner in October 1948. But what made him different was that Pignon had the same belief system as the Governor Generals of Indochina in the 1920s. Meaning that just like Pasquier in the 1920s, his aim was to weaponize the Vietnamese monarchy, to stifle Vietnamese nationalism, be it communist or non-communist. Pignon was convinced, for example, that it was under duress that Bao Daï abdicated to the Viet Minh in 1945. He was still convinced that Bao Daï was on the French side and could be a living symbol of what the French called la collaboration franco-annamite, or French-Vietnamese collaboration. What that meant was to have Bao Daï as a figurehead out there, cutting ribbons, smiling to rally the peasants, but all the power would remain with the High Commissioner, who would be pulling the strings behind the emperor. In Cambodia, the French could already count on the young king Norodom Sihanouk, who rallied the French in 1946. In Laos as well, the king Sisavang was a true French loyalist. But of course, Vietnam was the big prize, and Bao Daï needed to stop acting like a spoiled child and come back to the French fold. So Pignon got on the phone and said to Bao Daï, "Mate, do I have good news for you? You can come back to Vietnam right away because, wait for it, France has agreed to the independence of a unified Vietnam." Yes, you heard that right. Pignon said, "Okay, you Vietnamese can have Cochinchina." Pignon got rid of the 5 territories that made Indochina: Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And instead, he decided to create 3 associated states of Indochina: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Associated with Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam was integrated into the French Union. And in so doing, France agreed to reunify the colony of Cochinchina with the protectorates of Annam and Tonkin in one Vietnam. The principle of the unification of the country, so dear to all Vietnamese nationalists, was enacted. And this was the concession made to Bao Daï and to anti-communist nationalists. But there was a catch, of course. The 3 associated states of Indochina had to accept France as a 4th member. You know, kind of a big brother. France was the leader of the Union, and it was its responsibility as a leader to manage the relations between the associated states, but also to take care of their defense, to take care of their foreign affairs. Pignon called this 3+1 relationship, quote-unquote, quadripartism. And what was Pignon's plan here? Well, Pignon wanted to avoid at all costs that France be forced to grant total independence to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. He wanted to avoid what the UK did in India in 1947 or the US in the Philippines in 1946. And in 1948, he was also very anxious watching the United States, the United Nations, and India exert maximum pressure on the Dutch to withdraw from Indonesia. There was just a tidal wave of decolonizations in Asia, and Pinot had to find a way to prevent it happening in Indochina. And what he did very cunningly was, as we have seen, to give Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam a fake independence. Then he went to the Americans and said, guys, the communists are going to win in China, and the Soviet Union is threatening Europe. You've got to support us in Indochina, otherwise communism will win on both fronts. So basically helping France would stem the spread of communism in Asia, but in Europe as well. Yes, gentlemen, if you weaken France in Indochina, you also weaken her in Europe. And a weakened France in Europe cannot stand in the way of Stalin. Everything is linked, So be careful what you wish. If you come to France talking about ending the colonial system, blah, 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 well, you will help the communists win. And this was very clever from Pinot, using American fears of the Red Peril to ensure French colonial survival in Indochina. As a result, while the US pushed the Dutch to leave Indonesia, well, in Indochina, Americans backed Pinot's scheme because he sold it as the best move to fight communism. So now Ho Chi Minh was no longer a nationalist threat to the colonial order, but a key player of the Communist International. And Pinot's solution was a masterstroke. On the one hand, it made a concession by giving Bao Daï and nationalists around him what they wanted. This is a unified country. But he baked in French presence in Indochina by weaponizing Bao Daï's role to get American support. Pinot's efforts were rewarded, and on the 8th of March 1949, the Élysée Accords were signed, sealing the creation of the Associated States of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They were dubbed the Élysée Accords because they were signed at the Élysée Palace, the official residence of the French president. And to give you an idea of how disingenuous the French were, you remember they were saying that Cochinchina was a colony and that it was impossible to unify to the rest of Vietnam unless the French Parliament voted a constitutional amendment. Well, those constitutional roadblocks disappeared overnight. And immediately after the Élysée Accords were signed, Bao Daï came back to Vietnam and presided over the official creation of a unified, independent Vietnam. But as we have seen, the country was still far from being really and meaningfully independent. To start with, Bao Daï didn't control any square meter of the country. Secondly, France was still in control of the Associated States' finances, of their trade, of their defense, and of their foreign affairs. And as Lucien Baudard, a French journalist, put it, quote, quadripartism is continuation of Indochina in a different way, end quote. So what were the consequences for the three belligerents? Let's talk first about France. The French objective had always been American support. And with Bao Daï as head of state of the Associated States of Vietnam, the US were now on board. Historian Frederick Logevall reports that the American ambassador in Paris had the Élysée Agreement in his hands even before the French Parliament was sent a copy. As for Ho Chi Minh's DRV, it immediately denounced the agreement and issued an arrest warrant against Bao Daï, accused of high treason. Ho Chi Minh declared that the struggle continued until full independence. And by the way, just a quick thing I noticed when I was doing my research. At the same time the Associated States were created, the Vietnamese communists were taking a leaf out of the French colonialist playbook by extending their own influence in Indochina. You see, the DRV helped them launch resistance movements in Laos and Cambodia and involved them in the struggle for independence. In Laos, it was the Pathet Lao, and in Cambodia, it was the Khmer Issarak. So, because both France and the DRV were now working within the framework of Indochina, they were creating the necessary conditions for the war to spread to Cambodia and Laos. But let's go back to the Élysée agreements and how they were received by non-communist nationalists. Unfortunately for them, the Élysée Accords did not help making them more popular. I mean, everybody could see that the nationalists did not get what they wanted from France. But the question to ask is, what leverage did they have when negotiating with France? They had no leverage, no military power, no political power, nothing. Most nationalists felt they had just no choice than to follow the French. And only a few of them denounced the creation of the associated state, and one of them was our old friend Ngo Dinh Diem, who declared, quote, "The aspirations of the Vietnamese people will only be satisfied when our nation gets the same political status as India and Pakistan," end quote. He was referring here to the independence of these two nations. So no surge in popularity for the Bao Daï regime. The DRV was still seen by the people as the true resistance because they were actually fighting the French army. In his statements, Bao Daï said that he was bringing peace to the people. But the Vietnamese people were not stupid. They could see that Bao Daï did not have the military means to bring peace. And in fact, one of the first decisions of the new head of state was to create an army of the associated state of Vietnam. But the new army depended entirely on France for its weapons, its equipment, and most of its commissioned officers were not Vietnamese, but French. And this army would have no choice but to enter the war on the French side against the DRV. So instead of being an alternative to the DRV, Vietnam, or rather the associated state, just joined the French side. And the outlook was bleak for Vietnamese nationalists in a war that was about to become more brutal with the increasing involvement of the US and China. Their fate was shameful collaboration with the colonial power. So the French diplomatic victory was therefore another blow to the nationalists and to Bao Daï. They have only obtained a semblance of independence, and Bao Daï realized this very quickly as soon as he arrived in Saigon. When he arrived, he demanded that the High Commissioner vacated the Norodom Palace, the seat of the power in Vietnam. Léon Pignon flat out refused to let him in. And that move showed clearly who was the boss. The associated state was just a return to the protectorate of the 20s and the 30s. Bao Daï became very depressed by the whole situation, and just like in the 30s, he started dragging his feet. The French wanted him out there every day touting the new order, and he did, but he did so reluctantly and not often enough in French eyes. And at that moment, many nationalists would have liked Bao Daï to embark on a crusade for real independence, to draw the line there and stand up to the French. But Bao Daï just sulked and retreated. How to explain this apathy? Well, first of all, for some nationalists like Bui Diem, the issue was money. Diem was then a Dai Viet activist, and we already quoted him previously. He said that he and his comrades tried to convince Bao Daï to go to the confrontation with the French and threatened to resign if they did not grant him total independence. For that, they asked for an audience with the former emperor. And Diem said that the moment they brushed on the issue of real independence, Bao Daï cut short the audience. And the reason for Bui Diem were large transfers of French money to the emperor's offshore accounts. For him, we should look no further for the causes of Bao Daï's sluggishness. His princely lifestyle was completely dependent on French money, and he could not bite the hand that was feeding him. That may be true, but after reading Christopher Gauchat's research on colonial monarchies in Cambodia, Morocco, and Vietnam, I can see at least a couple of other possibilities. The first one is that Bao Daï lacked a je ne sais quoi. Gauchat doesn't use the word, but I would say perhaps charisma. And this is the difference between Bao Daï and Norodom Sihanouk, for example, in Cambodia. Sihanouk was a charismatic leader, and he was able to talk to the masses at their level. Bao Daï, on the other hand, was an introvert and did not seem comfortable among the masses. In addition, Bao Daï had spent his formative years speaking not Vietnamese but French in Paris. It was therefore difficult for him, I think, to create a direct link with the people, something that all charismatic leaders do. Think of Trump, Perón, or Fidel Castro. And this skill, Ho Chi Minh had it. Remember in episode 5, the August Revolution, when he started his speech on Ba Dinh Square, he won the audience with a simple question: can you understand me? And that's the type of thing charismatic leaders do. Cicero called it captatio benevolentiae. But charisma is not everything. Christopher Gauchat notes, for example, that Mohammed V in Morocco was not a naturally charismatic leader either. But what helped Mohammed V is the Moroccan context. In Morocco, the nationalists of the Istiqlal party were royalists as well. When they thought of independence, they did not picture anyone leading the fight other than the king. But that never crossed the mind of Ho Chi Minh or the Viet Minh. Even non-Marxists only came to Bao Daï as a last resort in 1947. And if you have listened to previous episodes, you can understand why. As we saw in episode 3, Vietnamese nationalism moved on from the monarchy at the beginning of the 20th century. Phan Boi Chau and Phan Chu Trinh already wrote that the country had to be rebuilt, not taken back to the Nguyen dynasty. And in the 1920s, with Ninh and the communists, everybody moved further away from the monarchy. Vietnamese nationalism in the 20th century was not royalist. And last point that explained Bao Daï's sluggishness was maybe the international context. If Vietnam had not been so close to China, perhaps the Americans would not have supported the French protectorate and would have put the same pressure on France as they put on the Dutch in Indonesia. To say it differently, in another territory or in another era that was less revolutionary than the post-war period in Vietnam, a sovereign with the same attributes as Bao Daï could have come out on top. But in Vietnam, after the Second World War, Bao Daï had neither the charisma of a Ho Chi Minh or a Norodom Sihanouk, nor the fighting spirit of a Ngo Dinh Diem, nor did he enjoy the de facto support of nationalists like Mohammed V in Morocco. I think that's a good time to stop it for today. Next week we'll move to 1949-1950, when the DRV will score its first diplomatic win after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. As a result, this Franco-Vietnamese colonial war, born of France's fierce desire to recover its empire and of the determination of the Vietnamese to stand on their own 2 feet, well, this war will turn into a different and more brutal conflict now that both China and the US are going to get involved. So thank you very much for listening. I'll see you at the next episode. Until then, take care and goodbye.